Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the CINECA webinar series, where Laurent Fromont will present the Beacon, a data discovery solution in genomics and health. My name is Marta Llorell Linares, and I'm involved in the CINECA project on behalf of MBLBI. This webinar is being recorded, including the question session at the end, and it will be available on the CINECA website and YouTube channel. We have reserved some time at the end of the webinar for questions from the audience. And if you have any questions, please write them in the Zoom Q&A function. I will briefly introduce you the CINECA project. CINECA is a 4-year project funded by the European Union's Horizon 2020 program and the Canadian Institute of Health Research. CINECA stands for Common Infrastructure for National Cohorts in Europe, Canada, and Africa. And its vision is to accelerate disease research and improve health by facilitating transcontinental human data exchange. To achieve this, CINECA is working in several challenges. The first one is federated data discovery. So how, as a researcher, you find cohort data of interest? This could be for a specific genotype or phenotype, for example. And then once you find this data, how do you get permission to access it? So CINECA is working on an interoperable authentication and authorization infrastructure. And once you get the data and want to ask research questions across cohorts, there's a need for harmonized cohort level metadata. The ultimate aim of CINECA is to enable federated data analysis for research and healthcare applications. So CINECA is working with a set of demonstrators in both research and clinical settings. On top of all this, there's a fundamental need for a transnational ELSI framework to address the ethical, legal, and societal issues. CINECA also has an outreach and training program to increase awareness and build capacity in these areas. If you want to stay informed on the progress of the project and of the activities that we organize, you can follow us on Twitter at CINECA Project or visit our website, cineca-project.eu. Today's presenter is Laurent Fromont, who is a scientific project manager at the European Genomic Archive at the Center for Genomic Regulation. A PhD in biomedical sciences from the University of Montreal, she specialized in cognitive neuroscience. She now coordinates projects funded by the European Commission and is actively involved in the elaboration of data models in various clinical settings. She also coordinates data discovery activities at TGA, in particular in the context of Beacon. In parallel, she's involved in Elixir projects and GA4GH discovery streams initiatives. At this point, I will hand over to Laurent.
So thank you very much, Marta, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for attending this webinar. So in the context of the CINECA project, this talk is really about the discovery part. So kind of federated discovery, the initial part in the cycle that Marta mentioned earlier. And it's more specifically about the Beacon. As Marta mentioned as well when she introduced me, I am a project manager, which means that I coordinate Beacon-related activities amongst other things. However, I'm not a bioinformatician or a developer, so if you ask very specific technical question, we have other people on this call who might be able to help me answer. And we'll advertise also subsequent training sessions which are more technical. So I will get started. What I'd like to start with is to get you through a little bit of the evolution of the Beacon concept from the first version. So in its first version, Beacon could be compared with a goldfish card game. In that it's a tool for data discovery, and originally the Beacon protocol in its first version, so 0 and 1, it allowed researchers to get information about presence or absence of a given specific genomic mutation in a set of data from patients of a given disease or from the population in general. So just like this goldfish game, you would ask the Beacon, do you have this specific variant and this specific chromosome in a given position? And the Beacon would answer yes, no, or the information is not available. Now, this is a very simple concept, and that was what really attracted users and implementers to deploy beacons and to start using it. However, it is, I apologize, a bit of cold. However, well, very early on, like within the first years of beacon implementations, we already talked about other features that would be very useful for beacon to become a service, as Jim also would say, or said once. So the director of the National Centers for Biotechnology Information mentioned that some features that could be added would be to provide frequencies of alleles at a certain point, select for specific gene region, and add more complicated queries. So the idea is really to transform this very simple concept in something that could really be useful in a large number of real world situations. And we know of a lot of quote unquote real world project, which mean projects in the clinical and clinical research settings that have to do with variant interpretation, variant databases, and those are somewhat isolated projects that are budding here and there. And of course, we also know that providing information about variants is a very long and complicated task. So even one of the most famous portals on variants, which is the BRCA web portal, has a majority of variants that have not yet been reviewed. So there's really a need for sharing the information about variant. There's a lot of work being done, but on the other hand, we know that it's an ongoing process, and Beacon is definitely part of this ongoing work, and we want to involve as many projects as possible in this. So the version 2 of Beacon, the one we're developing right now, is really impulsed by clinical needs. And a few years ago, we started doing surveys, we being the Beacon team. I was actually not part of that team yet. We started doing surveys with different centers and projects in order to pinpoint what types of activity they were doing and what kind of information they would like to have. And if you look at those pie charts, you will see that the majority of activities that were concerned really have to do with diagnosis and clinical research. And again, when the information about variants, the very overwhelming majority was about case information and variant annotations. So this more like quantitative surveying was followed by, say, more qualitative interviews with different projects, for example, driver projects and the Global Alliance. Some of them are part of CINECA, like Candig and H3 Africa, for example. And after all these interviews, we put together a list of features that the version 2 of the Beacon protocol should include. So now the specification will be submitted by the end of the month, so it's almost finalized. And it will include more informative queries, like, for example, filtering by gender or by age. It would include an option to trigger the next step in the data access process. For example, who to contact, what are the data use conditions. It would also include an option to jump to another system where the data could be accessed. So for example, if a beacon is for internal use of a hospital, it could provide the ID of the EHR of the patients that have the mutation of interest. It would also include annotations about the variant found. For example, the expert or clinician conclusion about the pathogenicity of a given mutation or its role in producing a given phenotype. And finally, it also will include information about cohorts, and I will get back to that in a moment. Now, there are a number of challenges and opportunities associated with the version 2 of Beacon, and this is these challenges and opportunities will be the topic of today's talk. So I've already stressed a lot that clinical requirements are a must in Beacon V2. And what we really want to do with this is, on the one hand, fine-tune Beacon queries to real-world needs, and on the other, making sure that Beacon implementation and maintenance is accessible in clinical setting. It is very challenging for institutions like hospitals in terms of human resources, for example, or resources that have to do more with IT to deploy a Beacon sometimes. So we really have to invest, the Beacon team has to invest a lot of time in making sure it is possible, it is feasible for them to deploy it. On the security end, well, we need to be ensuring security across different types of Beacon V2 instances, maybe in hospitals, research facility, cohorts, and so on. And make sure that we keep implementing the latest security features. And finally, I will talk about the Beacon network, which is really the end project for data discovery using Beacon. So I will show how this is really in the maps. This is something that has already been started, but really is a project for 2022 and 2023. So first of all, I will focus on clinical requirements. I wanted to give you an overview of the Beacon model. The Beacon model contains the data structure, that is schemas, for our biological data. So what it does really is that it describes the set of concepts that are included in a certain Beacon version. And although the subsequent training will go much deeper into the model and how it works, I would like to give an overview and to show you that the Beacon model really reflects the data cycle and all the steps are interests in clinical settings. So you would start with collections, which is what is collected by the experimenter and contains data sets and cohorts. And then it links to individuals that can be patients or healthy individuals from which we sample biosamples that are then analyzed in wet labs. And then from this is extracted genomic variations, which is more on the bioinformatics part. Now, as an example use case, I want to talk a little bit more about cohorts. The reason why I chose to talk more extensively about cohorts is that I think it's particularly useful for clinical settings, and also cohorts is an object that was really added after we started working in the CINECA project, during the work with the CINECA project. So I think it's interesting to spend a bit more time on this now. Now, let's imagine a dummy imaginary use case of a researcher who's evaluating the efficacy of chemotherapy on specific cancer types, depending on the age at which the cancer was diagnosed. So this researcher will start looking for cohorts that can be defined as sets of individuals that satisfy one or more inclusion criteria for a duration of time. So this researcher with Beacon can start querying for cohorts, and Beacon will provide a response, which is description about the cohort in the form of aggregating metadata. That will include binary information about whether or not certain data types are available, the number of individuals with each data type, and some summary statistics. Now think about this dummy use case and imagine that this researcher's first query is for individuals who were diagnosed with cancer before they turned 40. And imagine there happens to be an existing study that purposely recruited this population. So this is an example of a study-defined cohort. And the study-defined cohort can be either based on a pre-existing study, or it can be implemented as such for Beacon purposes. So in this case, the inclusion criteria for the cohort were defined by the study design or by the beacon implementer. And the response schema would include the study values, so the values that really pertain to the original design, and the calculated values from the cohort fields. So the user will know that the response is showing a study-defined cohort. Then for the second cohort of interest, the researcher might query individuals who were diagnosed after 40 years old. And imagine there's no existing study that recruited this population on purpose, but there are individuals in this database that correspond to these criteria. And so in that case, a user-defined cohort would be created on the fly by the beacon user upon query. So it means that the beacon user doesn't really have to change anything about their query, but the query itself will implicitly set the cohort criteria. Unlike the other one, the user-defined cohort does not have predefined values. So instead, they have the values of individuals that meet the criteria set by the query. Now, according to the beacon cohort model, a response to a query will provide cohort fields. And this is true for cohorts, but this is also an illustration for every object, right? These fields allow the user to get information about the cohort in the form of aggregated data. So in our case, we have 6 main blocks that will characterize a given response. So we have the metadata that includes the type of cohort, design, an identifier, a name, inclusion or exclusion criteria. Can include gender, ethnicity, age, condition, etc. The data usage indicates the purpose for which the data were used or could be used. You have statistics, which are counts. Data types refer to the ontology term that correspond to the types of data included in the cohort. And finally, collection events are a summary of the data points collected. So sometimes it could be in the form of aggregated data. These fields are particularly important because they will allow the user in one single look to access extensive information about a given cohort. So that will allow them to assess whether or not what is present in this database would fit the research question they are asking. So we talked about, so this is really the clinical requirements in the beacon model with this illustration. And another part that is very important is the implementation itself. So as I mentioned before, the beacon team is working hard with hospitals, and we started a project with several Catalan hospitals in order to help them implement beacons. And this is something our team member Manuel Rueda is working actively on. And what he does best is really show people how to use the reference implementation. And this is actually for those who will attend the internal CINECA training next week. This is what he will get you through. So we have these private meetings with hospitals, and we're also working on the documentation, and this is really for your information, but I think it's a good starting point. So if you're generally curious about the beacon, you can check our beacon website. If you're more on the implementer side and want something more technical, you can go directly to our GitHub, which also has extensive readmes about the framework and the model, which I just talked about. And finally, and this is still work in progress, but within a month, we would like to have a complete read the docs. You can already find information about the beacon schema, so what is in the model, but we want to have more complete user and implementer documentation in there, also to get you started with this. Something else we have developed to support implementers is the beacon verifier. So this was developed by our developers at the ETA. and in particular by Roberto Ariosa, who will be giving the training that is aimed at implementers. So if you are very familiar with how to build an API or this type of concepts, I think you would find his training very interesting. What we have, and we also want to build the same thing for CINECA, is in the form of a web page, we have compiled the results of compliance tests. So basically what you can see here is on the top, you can see the beacon details, and on the bottom, you can see the results of the compliance test. Whatever is in white means that it hasn't been implemented. And it's not, I mean, your beacon doesn't necessarily to implement all the endpoints. I talked about Cohort quite extensively, and I know for CINECA members, it is very relevant, but perhaps in your data set, you don't really have a use for Cohort, so you will not want to implement that. Whatever is in green would be that it corresponds to the beacon v2 specification, and in red means that it doesn't. So I purposely put beacons here that are being implemented, and this is updated regularly. So you see the green augmenting and increasing as we speak, almost. So now I want to say a word about security. So we adopt security access levels that are similar to most databases and archives. This is the case. This is what we're using at the EGA, for example, at the European Genome Archive. So we have three types of users. The basic type would be public user. So any user can, if it's public access, then any user can use the service and all the queries and get the complete responses. So that would be, for example, we have in CINECA a number of synthetic cohorts, which means that any public user should be able to access them because it's not necessarily sensitive. You might want to use a registered access. A registered access means that a user needs an account at the archive or service that is corresponding, for example, the EGA. So generally, the data processor here is the one that validates the account, and if the account is validated, then the user can use the service. And finally, we have the controlled access. And the controlled access is the most common when we're dealing with very sensitive, identifiable human data. And controlled access means that the access to the service needs to be previously authorized by a data controller, for example, a data access committee, which often corresponds to the data owner. So it's important to understand that if you use a beacon, if you deploy a beacon, you do not lose ownership over the data, and you do not necessarily use control, because you are absolutely entitled to decide what access level you want to use. And the beacon specification is there to make sure that the security settings will be employed. Now, related to security access, and also in a more general way, this means that beacon can allow for very simple queries. It can allow for Boolean responses, what you have on the left, or very detailed responses, what you have on the right. I will not go in the details of these responses because this is absolutely not my area of expertise, but I really just wanted to illustrate that you can perfectly have a beacon with very sparse Boolean responses for certain user, and then for other controlled users, you might want to give them access to a more detailed response. Finally, and this is, I mentioned that it was kind of the ultimate objective of the Beacon project is to have a beacon network. Why? So I mentioned that for every beacon, the security will be maintained and the clinical centers do remain data controllers. Now, what I presented to you, what would happen if you want to query a beacon? Well, you would ask individual beacons that pertain to different institutions, whether they have a given variant at certain position on a certain chromosome. And so if you have a research question, you would get to query individual beacons, get separated responses, which already really improves data and boosts data discovery. However, to really improve personalized medicine, to improve many types of research, especially facilitate research on rare diseases, you might want to need more because this is time consuming and you might want something more efficient. This is why we are building a beacon network. So the team that is in charge of building the beacon network is mostly based in Finland, and we are now talking to them so that the beacon network would be consistent with the version 2 specification. And how would that work from the user perspective? Well, from the user perspective, it's kind of similar, except that instead of using a beacon of one given institution, you would ask the query to the network, and you would ask this query, and then the network, which really works as a hierarchical aggregator of beacons, will basically relay the query to individual beacons and then aggregate the response and send it to the user. So I'm going towards the end of my presentation here. I want to stress that this is absolutely not the work of one single person. I want to acknowledge especially the Beacon team at the European Genome Phenome Archive, especially Jordi Rambla, who's the champion of the Beacon project, Manuel Rueda, who's a bioinformatician, and Roberto Ariosa, who's a developer, and the three of them are working very hard on the Beacon right now. I also, I think we can share the slides later so you can have access to the Beacon website, the GitHub. You can check the Beacon approval registry since we're about to submit. It's interesting to see how the number of beacons that are being implemented right now. And of course, feel free to contact me if you have any questions, if you're interested, or if you want to chat more about this. I'll be happy to answer all your questions. This is a project that was funded by Elixir. We also received funding from CINECA to implement the Beacon in the context of CINECA. And we received a lot of support from the EG and the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. And I would like to conclude by a little bit of advertisement. So I know Marta and Mamana will talk about the public training that will open for February. It will be like a more complete training, let's say, because we will have hopefully the project finalized by then. But for next week, for the ones who have registered to the CINECA internal trainings, and for next week, we will have 2 sessions. The first one on the 16th by Roberto will focus on the training for future implementers. So it will be quite technical. Don't be afraid, it's okay. But of course, if you have an experience building an API or if you're familiar with the concept, it will be easier to follow. While Manuel's training on the next day will be more on how to use the reference implementation. So it will be more for more clinical bioinformatics audience. And I want to stress that although the Beacon version 2 is almost finalized, it will be submitted at the end of the month. So we will be able to provide you with demos and so on. But for a bit more hands-on sessions, you will have to wait patiently until next year. And I will give the word back to Marta.
Thank you very much, Lauren, for the presentation. And yeah, now the floor is open for questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please type them in the Zoom Q&A, and then we'll have Lauren or any of her colleagues to answer them. Also, there's a question about the training next week. Thank you for a great talk. How do we sign up for the training next week? So if you are from the CINECA project, contact Lauren or contact me, and we'll be able to help you.
So yeah, we'll try to keep the next training internal inside CINECA. So, but I seem to remember there are some spots left for the trainings. So if you're in the CINECA project, we'll be happy to include you.
Yeah, and if you're not in the CINECA project, there will be a chance in February for an open course.
Contact us anyway.
Yeah,
basically. I hope I didn't scare everyone away.
There's a question coming there. Is there a due date for the Beacon network?
So I need to remember the specifics of the project, because I'm not sure. Because the project that has Beacon Network in it is until 2020, the end of 2023. But I don't have in mind the different milestones. So I know that the Beacon Network itself would be ready before that, but probably not in its final version. So what we're going to do now, I know they've started the work. We're going to meet with them in December and clarify a few things about the specifications and so on. So I can also keep you posted, Gordon, when I know more about their timeline.
Thanks, Lauren. We'll wait a couple more minutes in case there come more questions. Any more questions?
So if I remember correctly, the internal trainings in next week and also the public trainings that will happen in February will be it will be more regular Zoom sessions, right? And the idea is that really there will be questions this time, more questions, because I know what I presented was more general, but I think once we start entering into the specifics, it raises a lot of questions, especially in the experience of the people who will give the trainings, and they will make sure that that the floor is really open and that we can see all your faces and so on.
Yeah, you can move to the other slide. So we already showed the dates for the training in February. Then, so yeah, we'll have these two courses, the same as Lauren talked about. For next week, we have the training for implementers will be on the 15th of February, and then the one more for users will be on Thursday, the 17th of February. And the information for registering in both of them are in the CINECA project website. So you can visit that one and register already for those training events.
Mm-hmm. And the one that will be very much different. So even if you're attending the one in November, you might want to sign up again for February's the one for users, because right now, since we're still working on deploying the beacon. So we discussed a little bit with our teams and we found that it was more important to focus on how to use the reference implementation. So a bit like how we help hospitals and clinical centers to use that reference implementation. But then once we have the beacon established and so on, we can show a bit more about queries and things like that. And this will be public and very probably shared with Elixir and the Global Alliance. So we might even consider putting in more dates if necessary to make sure that the groups are small and we can have discussion.
Okay, so I think we'll leave it here for today. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and thank you very much, Lauren, for the talks. We'll see some of you in the upcoming trainings.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice day.